the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. This is episode 381 of the podcast. Hey, if you at all enjoyed last week's episode 380, Fly Fishing Accusations 38, feel free to send me your questions, your comments, and your accusations, Matthew at castingacross.com. I always get a flurry of feedback in the wake of those accusations episodes. And so that's 10 weeks in between when I release one and the next one. But I do try to get back to folks as soon as I can. And so definitely send things my way. And as I've done before in the past, if I get a handful of questions or comments all on the same topic, that might warrant its own podcast episode. And so if the people speak, I listen. I don't always respond, but I listen. I always respond, but it's in email form, not on the podcast. Okay, today we're talking about fly fishing for big fish, and who doesn't want to do that? Well, I'm talking specifically about what are called predatory fish, what are called sometimes toothy fish, just big freshwater fish. And, this is kind of an arbitrary designation that we make in fly fishing, because if you want to fish for big fish, go fish for catfish. And you can fish for cat with a fly rod, but it's not a normal approach. Fish for saltwater fish, which of course there are big predatory saltwater fish. And of course there's big trout out there. But really what we're talking about isn't salmon or steelhead. It's not the biggest trout. It's not inshore fly fishing for saltwater species. It's really talking about those big freshwater predatory fish. Now, this can be a number of things. And actually, one of the examples that I'm going to give here is not super capital P predatory, but I would say the biggest largemouth bass, and I would say big smallmouth bass. I would put some large trout fishing in this category. I'll talk about that in a second. But again, that's kind of a secondary way to look at that. Pike and muskie fall into this category. You can even say other species, kind of like snakehead or gar, things like that, which are very, very regional, but are something that you can pursue. And you could definitely put the carp in this list. And carp are by no means like going to attack you or going to take a chunk out of your hand. But a lot of the gear is similar, and I'll talk about that here in a second. But I'm going to give the old caveat that I try to give whenever I talk about fly fishing gear. And again, I'm strongly opinionated about gear, but I don't say I'm dogmatic about it. And what I mean by that is that, if you have your 5-weight that you love, and for whatever reason, whether it's you just like to be minimalistic, you have budgetary constraints, you're not sure that you really want to invest the time, effort, energy, resources, et cetera, into a bunch of new stuff, then by all means, use that 5-weight. Use it for fly fishing for trout on small mountain creeks. Use it for fly fishing for trout on big rivers. Use it for chasing smallmouth. Use it for chasing largemouth. Hey, for all I care, go take out on the surf and cast the biggest clouser you can on that 5-weight and have an absolute blast doing it. We are, in one sense, spoiled by options today. Now, that doesn't mean that you rewind 75 years and the people that were fishing for, salmon were using trout gear. They were using salmon gear, but the flexibility, the diversity of application for a contemporary trout rod really makes it a very efficient tool for a lot of fly fishing. And there's times out of necessity, if I'm traveling and I only want to bring one rod, where I'll use rods that are, specially suited for kind of a very, very specific range of angling options, and I'll use them for whatever I can. And at the end of the day, I don't feel like, I was really hampered by that. I mean, like, say it's a 10-car rod, you're going to be hampered by only being able to cast 30 feet. But otherwise, just use what you have, use what you enjoy. That said, I know that there is a significant component of anglers in fly fishing who want to have stuff that kind of is tailor-made and fits what they are seeking to primarily do when they go fly fishing. So that's the big, the introduction and the caveat. Introduction, we're talking about fly fishing for predatory big freshwater fish. And secondly, just do what you want to do, use what you want to use. So let's talk about fly rods first and foremost. Now, I fish a lot of times for fish like this with a 6 weight, and here's why. I go fly fishing for smallmouth bass, and I have a couple of 6 weights I really like fishing for smallmouth with. Sometimes I feel like they're slightly undersized, and I'll talk about why that is in a second, but I do feel like I can get away with fishing those 6 weights pretty well. And I get into a situation where I do see that big carp, or I do see a toothy fish like a pike or even a really really big pickerel, chasing bait up in the grass flats, and I'm just going to throw on the fly that I want to throw on, and the cast may be a little bit more labored, but it's going to work. That said, why I always suggest to people who are really going to be fishing for larger smallmouth bass, for largemouth bass, and for those toothy fish I mentioned, and also chasing carp, I say start thinking about that 7 weight, that 8 weight, and that 9 weight. And here's the reason why. It is about the flies you are throwing. Not so much with carp. I mean, they're going to be kind of their own thing. I'm just going to always add these little carp caveats in here. But having that 7 weight, that 8 weight, that 9 weight is going to allow you to throw a heavier line, which is going to help turn over heavier flies. And not necessarily even heavier flies, but flies that become heavy when they become saturated with water, or flies that are wind resistant. So real quick, when we're fishing for these larger fish, we could be using a number of things. We could be using a deer hair bass bug that floats like a popper. We could be using a deer hair bug that dives. We could be using a large streamer that has a significant number of long saddle hackles in it. We could be using a foam bug that you throw, and those flies are going to be heavy compared to your size 14 nymph or your size 16 dry fly, or even your size 8 beadhead or conehead woolly bugger. Every fly I previously mentioned is going to be much heavier than those flies, but because of their shape. Because of the fact that their shape is meant to displace water, and water and air have a lot of similarities, they are not going to move through the air easily when you cast them. And so you're going to want to have a rod that can throw a line that is going to help you put these flies where you want to put them. I think a lot of folks that I've fished with that have been down on fly fishing for bass, just to kind of pick a very, very common species that people fish for that's not trout, they don't like how those flies are hard to throw. And they think that, and I say this about trout fishing too, well, if I throw an 8 weight and I'm catching like 14 and 16 inch, pound and a half bass, that's not going to be any fun. And just like I say when you're fishing like a stiffer 3 weight for brook trout, no, these days in the 21st century, the technology and the materials make it such that the rod is still going to bend and still have the sensitivity that you want when you're fighting those fish. And you're going to catch more of those fish, and you're going to have the opportunity to catch larger versions of those fish if you can throw those flies everywhere and anywhere that you want to throw them. So for all the fish that I mentioned, I start thinking of 7, 8, 9. Now, of course, if you are talking about really big pike and muskie, then 9s and 10s and even 11s are going to be a part of that conversation. But if you want a nice all-around rod, then I would say something like an 8 weight or a 9 weight is going to give you a lot of options. Of course, this depends on where you fish. It depends on the kind of water you fish. It depends upon, and I mean kind of water, that could be like how much wind are you going to get? Are you fishing out on open lakes? Are you chasing pike and muskie on big lakes where you are going to, or even on a river that's relatively open? Then you're going to want that heavier rod, because as you're fishing early season or you're fishing late season and there may be a little bit more wind, you're going to not only need a line that can help turn over those large flies and a rod that can throw that line. You're going to want one that's able to throw that line and turn over that fly with the kind of line speed and power to even combat and counter those impacts of that wind that you might get when you're on open water or in a larger river. So the 8 weight, that 9 weight, and even again, if you're talking about toothy fish, bigger fish, where you're throwing those, flies that are potentially as long as your forearm, cubit length, then you're going to want the heavier rods. And again, that's the weight designation. Now, cast those rods, figure out what you like, throw on a big fly. Don't cast a leader on a fly line out in the parking lot of the fly shop and say, yeah, this feels great. I can really turn this over. No, get a big thing and put it on there. I mean, take your sock off for goodness sake and put it on there. If they don't want to let you, if you don't have a fly that is hookless, definitely do that. And here's a quick aside. When you talk about approach and you've only cast maybe like one-aught clousers and things like that, and you think about a clouser, particularly if it's tied with synthetic materials, it's a heavy fly. Those barbell eyes are going to be heavy, but it's not the same as a fly that's tied with a bunch of big, full chicken feathers that are saturated with water. Even if there's no weight on them, that's the way that feels when you're casting is totally different. So get out in the lawn and cast. When you're searching for and shopping for a fly rod, put a fly on there. It is a completely different ball game. I know that that my saltwater rods, for example, same kind of situation. The way they cast with big weighted streamers, and whether it be a clouser or some other, even a crab or something like that has some weight on it, versus a weighted down sand eel or a deceiver that has natural materials, it feels very, very different to have that weighted body of that fly weighted down with water, and those natural materials that are a little more absorbent generally than a fly that, although there's some added weight to it, they are made of synthetic materials that repel water, maybe not even have any absorption at all. It's very, very different. So get out and cast when you're buying and when you're practicing with a fly that is going to simulate what you are fishing with. Again, I say a strip of cloth, of cotton, is just going to do better than anything if you aren't about tying flies without hooks, which, I mean, you should be able to do pretty easily. All right. So that's the weight designation. Now, the length thing, this is kind of interesting. So I've talked about before how I like fishing rods that are odd lengths. I like fishing lighter weight lines. When I'm fishing from a watercraft, I like a longer rod, 9.5, 10 feet. When I'm fishing for trout, especially if I am potentially fishing dry flies on still waters or on larger rivers where I am floating in a canoe or kayak or even a drift boat, I like having that longer rod so my mending is easier and so I can pick up more line off the water more efficiently. Even 6 inches does give you that benefit. But now when we're talking about fishing larger flies, and it is something like a streamer or some sort of surface pattern or even a diving bug for these predatory fish, if you can find a rod that is in that 7'9" to 8.5" category, that is going to give you a lot more control when you're manipulating those flies. There's a number of manufacturers that do create these kind of shorter, and again, it's not crazy short, or 8 to 8.5 foot rods that are for this particular type of fishing. I think that it gives you a lot of control when you are making your retrieve. And I think when you are casting, it allows for a quicker pickup and a quicker motion, both into your back cast, aerializing that line and that heavier fly and pushing it back forward. But a 9-foot rod will be totally fine for any circumstance. But don't rule out those rods that are specifically made for this purpose. A number of the manufacturers make them, and there's a reason for that. I like a faster action fly rod only because it is really what the whole game is designed around. Now, I have fiberglass rods that are heavier that I think are kind of fun. I have older bamboo rods that would have been your only option at one point in time if you want to do this kind of fishing. And it's doable. It's just not going to be the easiest casting stroke. Your loops are going to be larger, and you've got this giant fly that is going to be moving in a much wider arc. And simply for efficiency's sake, and to a certain degree safety's sake, I want to have my loops a little bit tighter when I'm casting these big, heavy flies, and so they're not, flailing around and hitting me. And I can make a quicker change of directions without making as many false casts if I have a faster fly rod. So I like to have something that's not like broomstick fast, but again, as long as that line, which we'll talk about here in a second, is paired well with that rod, then you're going to be able to fish, pretty much any fast rod well. All right, so that's a couple of words on rods as well as practicing casting. Now, fly line. So you can use whatever, the generic 7-weight, 8-weight, 9-weight line. Particularly once you get into those like 8, 9 weights, you're going to be moving out of kind of the lines that are designed for general trout fishing, and you're going to be moving more towards lines that are probably going to be for saltwater fishing if they're kind of the entry level. That said, there are lines that are, specifically designed in their taper and the grain weight within that taper for turning over large flies. I think you can get away with anything. You don't have to go to that upper tier fly line that is specifically for predators or for toothy fish or for large bass or for whatever it is. If you're throwing larger flies, and again, so the carp are kind of on the side here. For the carp, when it comes to this kind of discussion, the fly line, your trout stuff's going to work just fine. That's really what it comes down to. Your rod, you want something that's going to be able to cast with the same kind of efficiency and the same kind of finesse, especially if you're fishing, you're sight fishing for carp. But when we get to talking about all the other fish, a line that is specifically designed both in the taper and in the grain weight to be able to turn over heavy flies is going to really give you a lot of benefits. And again, broken record saying this, the difference between the general all-purpose line and the species or use-specific fly line is like $30, right? So it's definitely worth doing, especially if you get into those windy conditions, especially if you're fishing that big waterlogged streamer or that big wind-resistant bass bug that's going to be on the surface. You're going to want something that is going to assist you in throwing that line. So you got your fast action rod, and you have that line with probably a more abrupt taper. When you start aerializing 30 feet of line, it's going to really do a great job of shooting that thing back, shooting it forward as you go to make your presentation. So definitely consider that. Most major manufacturers have a version of this because it is popular, and people do recognize the benefits of having a line that has this kind of taper in this type of fly fishing. Now, I think it's also worth saying that for certain types of fishing like this, it may be worth having some sort of sinking or sink tip fly line. I'm thinking about a lot of these ambush predators, and it's awesome when you get to fish docks, you get to fish weed lines, you get to fish overhanging foliage or other kinds of cover like that, because it's just fun to fish that way. And it's if the fish are up there because of the season, because of the conditions, then it just is a real nice way to key in on holding spots for these fish. But if you're having to fish drop-offs, if you're having to fish ledges, if you're having to fish submerged weed beds that may be on humps or on submerged islands and things like that, then having a line that has a sink rate is going to be the way to go, because instead of having this hinge where you have this really heavy fly on a probably a pretty stout fly rod and the appropriate fly line, you're able to maybe use a fly that is less weighted, isn't going to have as much of a weight added to it, and it's going to make casting so much easier. And if you've cast for salt, if you've cast for these larger fish, you know how that really does wear on you over the course of a day. If you're tired after fly fishing for trout for 8 hours, it's a much different ball game, especially if you're seated like in a canoe. But even if you are standing up in a boat or walking, making those long casts, repetitive casts with these heavy flies. So if you can use a little bit of a lighter fly and a line that's going to help get that fly down, it evenly distributes the weight that goes into the whole equation, making your cast a little bit easier. And again, I can't tell you if you want a full sinking line or if you want an intermediate or sink tip. It all really depends on where you're fishing. But bare minimum, I think like a sink tip line gives you a lot of advantages. And again, if you're out on a watercraft, which for a lot of these fish, this is a little bit of a side. You don't need to buy a boat, right? But for a lot of these fish, having a canoe is really helpful. If they're holding tight to the bank, then your best presentation is to make that cast up close to the bank and then pull it back away to simulate what a fish is going to do. A fish is going to run up on the bank, right? It's going to move back into open water. And so that's what those fish are used to. But a lot of these fish like to hang out in ambush points, and those are best accessed from the interior side of the water body. So if it's a drop off, well, then you can much more efficiently present a fly going from the shallower to the deeper, or parallel to that ledge, than you would be from the shore, which you'd be making a retrieve from deeper to shallower. It's nice to be able to fish up to and then down into that drop off. Again, you can do whatever you want to do, and you can catch fish anyway, and I have. But having a watercraft, whether it be a belly boat, whether it be a kayak or a canoe, 200, $300, not a super huge investment. Or of course, you have something much more sizable and easier to navigate around with, and that's great. But all I had to say, having that intermediate or that sink tip fly line gets those flies down without having to have versions of those flies in many different weights. I would, and again, this may be, not the most budget friendly thing, but actually I think it is because flies are not cheap, especially these big flies. I'd rather have two spools of fly line than two fly boxes. All right. I'd rather be able to use the same flies up close to the surface in the intermediate area and then down deeper. Use same flies and then have a spool that I can switch into to get all of those flies down deeper rather than have two big boxes of flies. All right, so talk about rods, talk about reels. I did the next big thing because we're not going to talk about flies. I mean, use whatever flies. Use your big trout flies, but then of course once you get into it, you're going to figure out what fish, where you fish, what kind of fish you're looking for. Um, and again, I've thrown carp in this area, this conversation, and use a lot of your trout flies. A lot of your trout flies are going to work just fine, and a lot of your trout leaders are going to work just fine. With the exception, I would say, maybe if you're fishing something with a little bit of weight on it, having a heavier butt section to help kind of turn that fly over and make that transition from your line to your leader. But thinking about those bigger bass and those toothy fish, you're definitely going to want a stout leader. Now, I have used level leaders in the past. It's easy to go to Walmart or Bass Pro Shop and just buy a spool of 12-pound test and clip off 6 to 8 to 10 feet and tie a loop on there, loop to your fly line, and you're good to go. It works. It doesn't work great. I am okay with using a butt section, so you have kind of a transition, and it's something like a 30-pound test or something like that, 24-pound test, where you have a butt section of monofilament between your fly line and maybe a level section of 12-pound test. That is much better than going 12-pound test to fly line. But for a few reasons. One, that butt section material is oftentimes going to be much more stiff, which is going to help turn over those larger flies. It's also going to help with the presentation and the accuracy of your cast because it is going to allow and facilitate that energy transfer from that unrolling fly line into your leader to your fly so that you can present it with a little bit more accuracy without having to factor in kind of that hinge point of fly line going to narrower monofilament. That said, I like to use a heavy butt section, and the cheap and easy way to do this is to buy a knotless tapered leader that matches the kind of fishing you're doing. So it goes down to whatever 10-pound test or 12-pound test and clip it off at about 5 feet and then create a loop to loop from that to your next section of monofilament. And they do sell a stiffer monofilament for this type of fishing. Now, what that gives you is a few things. One, it will help you turn over that fly. Secondly, it's going to give you more control as you make retrieves. Thirdly, it's going to provide a little bit more abrasion resistance. Generally, the more stiff the monofilament, the more abrasion resistance that you're going to have. The more supple, it's going to nick and kink a lot more. It's just the way it goes. But again, we're 21st century technology, and we have it so good, even to when I started fishing and fly fishing back in the 90s. So then, you also have to factor in if you're fishing for pike and muskie, which I don't know if I caveated this at the beginning or not. I've never intentionally fished for muskie. Not that I haven't wanted to. It's just not been something that I have done on purpose. I've fished places where there are muskie, but I've been fishing for smallmouth and things like that. But delegitimizes everything I've said. But go, as always, go check the other resources. But if you're fishing for things with teeth, those pike, even the big chain pickerel, then you can always get a wire leader and easily attach that with a number of different methods. I like using little small rings. I think that's the best way when I've used wire leader, both freshwater and saltwater. That is my preferred way to do it. It's pretty quick and pretty easy. Allows for swapping things out because you don't want to use a wire leader if you are going to switch over to fishing for bass or something like that. It's just completely unnecessary and makes casting and presentation a little bit more cumbersome. So that is a basic overview of gear: rods, lines, and leaders. The flies, of course, you use the flies that you have to use in that particular situation. The bass are going to want something different than the pike. The pike are going to want something different than the carp, of course. But you're going to find, some overlap. I love fishing crayfish patterns, crayfish imitations for large smallmouth bass. I love dead drifting them. I love letting them go down to the bottom on still water and moving them very, very slowly. It's if you have the patience, it's a killer way to catch big smallmouth and largemouth for that matter. But it's also a great way to catch carp. And so you're going to have a little bit of overlap there. When you're fishing for really big largemouth bass, using those long, multi-hackled streamers that you would use for muskie are going to work for bass as well. You look at what the guys are using on the bass tournaments. I'm not sure if you pay attention to that, but I do because I think it's interesting. And they're just giant. They're trout imitations. So why not throw those for big largemouth bass if you live somewhere where those fish can be found? And again, bass eat something like up to like 2/3 to 3/4 of their length. So don't feel like you're overkill, especially if you're fishing for big fish. And I guess that's the last kind of piece of information I'll share here. If you know that the water body you're fishing has the carrying capacity or the population to support really, really large predators, know that the larger fly that you're using, you are probably lowering the number of fish that you're going to catch, but you're probably increasing the chance of getting into those largest fish. Okay? It's the same game that's played for people fishing for trout with big streamers. They go down to places like Little Red River in Arkansas and the White River in Arkansas, and they cast these giant streamers for trout. Well, the density of fish in these rivers is astronomical, but they are passing over 99% of the fish in the river because they want that one big brown, that one big predatory trout. Same idea when you're fishing for bass, largemouth, smallmouth, pike, muskie, and some of the other fish that we've mentioned also. You are taking a lot of those fish out of the equation. Your bycatch is going to drop to almost nothing, but it is going to put you in front of those larger fish. And so if that's something you want to do, then you carry those big flies so that you can make those presentations. All right, so much on the cutting room floor. So much more that can be said, but go out and do some research. There are podcasts, there are certainly websites and books that are all about each aspect of everything I've talked about today. You can do a much deeper dive, but what I wanted to talk about today, especially because this is being recorded in February, as people are thinking about what fishing is going to look like for this season, think about, can I just use what I have? Maybe I can use some of what I have. Yeah, go ahead and use that saltwater gear. If you're not going to be hurting yourself, and if anything, I'd rather have a one setup that I can use in the saltwater that's designed for that I can then bring over the freshwater if I want to, than the other way around, just because of the components, the drag systems, things like that. So anyway, so much more could say, but that is where we're going to leave it today. Questions, ideas? Let me know. Matthew at castingacross.com. This week on Casting Across. First article was called "Standing in River Smoking a Stick, Big Sky Cigar." So I enjoy a good cigar and a nice pipe every now and again. And I got thinking, a lot of guys I know that fly fish smoke cigars, and it's kind of a thing that you even see or smell when you're on the water. Why are there not more fly fishing themed or fly fishing aesthetic in cigar manufacturing? And so I got online, did some searching, and I found Big Sky Cigar Company out of Montana. Had a good conversation with their VP, and just like to learn a little bit more about the history of tobacco in Montana and this company. So if you're interested, check them out. And this is kind of cool. I asked them, I said, hey, where would you want me to send them to buy cigars? And I said, would you like your website? He said, no, one of my retailers. And I said, okay, well, tell me your retailer. He says, Two Guys Cigars. I go, well, is that only because I'm in New England? He says, no, that's one of our biggest online sales partners. And they're like, I don't know, 15 minutes from where I live. So they're not my local cigar. My local cigar shop is Twins Cigar in southern New Hampshire. But Two Guys is all fine and good too. So anyway, if you want to learn about Big Sky Cigar Company, then head over to Casting Across. Wednesday's video was on independent fly fishing books, in which I briefly review 3 fly fishing books that all were self-published or independently published. I have a big stack of books that fall into this category, and I enjoy reading them, some more than others, but the 3 that I mentioned today or in this video were worth checking out. That said, this week's recommendation on the podcast. Check out these books. How do you check out these books? A couple different ways. You can go to the website, castingacross.com, and you can watch the video on that article's content, or you can go to YouTube and subscribe to Casting Across, and then you can check out in the show notes links to where you can find these books. And I would just say, give it a look. One of the things I mentioned in the description of that video is that books like this, any fly fishing book, isn't always going to have mass appeal across the board. However, if this person fishes where you fish, or they fish with a perspective that's similar to yours, it doesn't need to be coming from one of the big fly fishing publishers. It needs to be a book that you enjoy. So 3 books, kind of 3 different perspectives, definitely worth checking out over at castingacross.com. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe to your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go in pursuit of fish.